Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett, and in this bulletin we've got a roundup of stories developing around the world. First, the headlines. It's budget day in the UK. British Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak is set to unveil his budget any moment now in the House of Commons in London. He'll confirm billions in spending aimed at boosting the post-COVID economy. Foreign ministers of countries neighbouring Afghanistan are set to meet in Tehran. Counter-terrorism and an inclusive government remains the top focus of the talks. Sudanese Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok has been released and taken back to his house amid intense international pressure following his removal in a military coup. India's homegrown COVID vaccine Covaxin, developed by Bharat Biotech, fails to get a green light from the WHO's Technical Advisory Group, which is now seeking more clarifications from the developers. A Brazilian Senate commission backs a damning report that recommends criminal charges against President Jair Bolsonaro, including crimes against humanity, for his COVID policies. Australia decides to lift a ban on citizens travelling overseas. Fully vaccinated citizens will no longer have to seek an exemption to leave the country. Now, any second, the Boris Johnson government will unveil its latest budget and spending review. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is saying the budget begins the work for preparing a new economy post-COVID. He claims the budget will deliver a stronger economy fit for a new age of optimism. The UK government is trying to make sure the public finances are in good shape after emergency pandemic support sent debt rocketing. Government borrowing increased to around £320 billion in the financial year to March, driven higher by COVID support. That was equivalent to 14.9% of GDP, the highest UK level since the end of World War II. Now, in this budget, Rishi Sunak will confirm multi-billion pound funding for projects aimed at debt recovery and reducing pressure on the National Health Service. On the eve of the budget, the government confirmed plans to raise minimum wage rates and end a freeze on pay rises for public sector workers. Much of the contents of the Chancellor's policy reviews and spending plans are already known, following a raft of announcements in recent days. That has angered the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle. He says it's not acceptable for ministers to give briefings to the media before Parliament. Now, to take you through some of the policies already unveiled by the government ahead of the Chancellor's budget, we'll see expenditure on transport projects, extra funding for the National Health Service, a rise in the national living wage. Other measures include spending to encourage foreign investment into the UK, funding on the new post-Brexit border and immigration system, a 6-month extension to the COVID recovery scheme as well to June 2022. And as I say, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, will be on his feet in the House of Commons in moments from now after the weekly Prime Minister's Questions session. Rishi Sunak standing up now as we speak in the House of Commons, about to set out his latest budget.
Wages are rising. Today's budget delivers a stronger economy for the British people, stronger growth with the UK recovering faster than our major competitors, stronger public finances with our debt under control, stronger employment with fewer people out of work and more people in work. Growth up, jobs up and debt down. Let there be no doubt our plan is working. Madam Deputy Speaker, this budget is about what this government is about. Investment in a more innovative, high-skilled economy, because that is the only sustainable path to individual prosperity. World-class public services, because these are the common goods from which we all benefit. Backing business, because our future cannot be built by government alone, but must come from the imagination and drive of our entrepreneurs. Help for working families with the cost of living, because we will always give people the support they need and the tools to build a better life for themselves. And levelling up, because for too long, far too long, the location of your birth has determined too much of your...
The second round of the foreign ministers' meetings on Afghanistan's neighbours, is being held in Tehran. The meeting comes more than a month after the first round of talks were held virtually. Foreign ministers from China, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan and a representative from Russia will participate in this meeting. The focus of the talks is to discuss the necessity of forming an inclusive government in Afghanistan. The Taliban has been criticised for exploiting the rights of women and minority communities. After taking control of the country, the Taliban promised a moderate form of administration, guaranteeing women their rights as per Sharia law. However, Western countries have been sceptical about the Taliban's intentions and record since taking over. The economic security of Afghanistan will also be one of the focal points of the discussions. After the Taliban takeover, the United States froze Afghanistan's $9 billion worth of assets. The country slipped into economic and financial crisis. Poverty and inflation are at all-time highs. A United Nations report says more than half the population is facing record levels of acute hunger. Apart from that, countering terrorism will be another key point of discussion. The first round of talks, as we were saying, was held virtually back on September the 8th. That round was hosted by Pakistan. The participants emphasised support for sovereignty and territorial integrity of Afghanistan. A joint statement called for the formation of an inclusive government. Leaders discussed the importance of not allowing Afghanistan's territory to be used to threaten other countries. Now, ahead of the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, another warning from the United Nations. According to the latest UN report, current commitments to cut greenhouse gas emissions put the planet on track for an average 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature rise this century. The UN chief is calling the report a thundering wake-up call. World leaders will be in the spotlight at the UN Climate Summit next week to meet a deadline of this year to commit to more ambitious pledges in what could be the last chance to put the world on track to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
The clock is ticking. The emissions gap is the result of a leadership gap, but leaders can still make this a turning point to the inner future instead of a tipping point to climate catastrophe.
A call to action from United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres Tuesday, as a newly published UN report found that despite international commitments to cut greenhouse gas emissions, the planet is on track for a 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature rise this century, a rise Guterres called catastrophic. The warning comes as world leaders are to meet at the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow next week to try to commit to a more ambitious climate pledge. It could be the last chance to reach the goal of the 2015 Paris Climate Accord to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius.
As world leaders prepare for COP26, this report is so another thundering wake-up call. How many more do we need? The recent IPCC report already showed that unless we reduce global carbon emissions by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, 100 months from now, we will not reach a 1.5-degree future.
The report said G20 countries, which represent 80% of global emissions, are not on track to achieve their original or new 2030 pledges. And as extreme weather events like wildfires and floods continue to wreak havoc globally, Guterres said the heat is on leaders to do more.
The heat is on. And as the contents of the report show, the leadership we need is off. And far off. We know that humanity's future depends on keeping global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. And we also know that so far, parties to the Paris Agreement are utterly failing to keep this target within reach.
Next to Brazil, where a Senate investigative committee has approved a report that calls for President Jair Bolsonaro to be indicted for 9 crimes related to his handling of the COVID pandemic, including crimes against humanity. Besides criminal charges, the report also recommends charges of charlatanism, prevarication and inciting crime to misuse of public funds. 7 of the panel's 11 senators voted to endorse it. A draft report released last week had called for Bolsonaro to be indicted for genocide and murder. Senators decided to drop those charges due to what lawmakers described as technical reasons.
A Brazilian Senate committee approved a report on Tuesday that calls for an indictment of President Jair Bolsonaro for his handling of the coronavirus pandemic. It includes crimes against humanity and 8 other charges. The rapporteur of the report, Senator Renan Calheiros, said, quote, "The chaos of Jair Bolsonaro's government will enter history as the lowest level of human destitution." The more than 1,300-page report, which took the committee over 6 months to prepare, alleges nearly 80 other people and 2 companies committed crimes. Among those in the firing line was the governor of the interior Amazonas state, Wilson Lima, who's been accused of corruption related to the purchasing of medical equipment. Earlier this year, hospitals in the state lacked oxygen supplies, which resulted in deaths by asphyxia. A draft of the report originally called for Bolsonaro to be indicted for genocide and murder, but senators later decided to drop those charges. The president's press office did not immediately respond to a request for comment. It's unlikely he'll face any formal charges, as they'd have to be brought by Brazil's prosecutor general, a seat Bolsonaro appointed. The president has previously dismissed the Senate investigation as a joke.
Russia is battling a worsening COVID crisis. The daily COVID-19 death toll has hit a record for the 6th time on Tuesday in the last 8 days. The health minister says infections were up by more than 10% in the past week. Russia's ordered regional leaders to step up their fight against COVID-19. As the country battles a new wave of coronavirus, some of the country's hospitals are at breaking point.
The wards are full in this hospital in Volzhitsky, Russia. As the country battles with a new wave of coronavirus infections, increasing numbers of admissions are putting the health service under strain, and many of its doctors and nurses are reaching breaking point. Hospital 1, just outside of Volgograd in southwest Russia, had no extra bed capacity earlier this week, as Deputy Chief Physician Roman Mironov explains.
At the moment, the hospital is completely full. It has 540 beds. 490 patients are now in the wards, and 50 patients are in the intensive care unit. We are completely full. Most of them, 98 to 99%, are not vaccinated.
Only 35% of the country have had 2 doses of a coronavirus vaccine. Record high cases, which have been blamed on slow vaccination rates, have prompted the authorities to reimpose partial lockdown measures. On Tuesday, Russia reported 1,106 COVID-19 deaths in the past 24 hours, the highest figure since the start of the pandemic. Yelena, a medic in the hospital in Volzhitsky, has been working with COVID patients since the start of the pandemic, but says this time the situation in Russia feels more grave.
The disease is more severe, with more complications. I think that last year it was easier. This disease spares no one.
The International Olympics Committee is facing one of its biggest challenges yet: to protect the Beijing Winter Olympics from coronavirus. The threat of COVID-19 looms over the Games as cases surge in cities across China. Nearly 3,000 athletes are due to participate in the Games. Those not following the rules will be disqualified. All athletes must be fully vaccinated or face 21 days quarantine. Authorities say all preparations for the Games are complete.
不遵守这个防疫手册的规定的，可能会面临着警告、临时或永久撤销注册资格、临时或永久取消参赛资格或者逐出比赛、取消相关资格和惩罚等比较严重的后果。
The country's reported 50 new domestic cases across 6 provinces in the last 24 hours. The city of Lanzhou, which lies close to Beijing, has been put under a lockdown. 4 million people in China have been ordered to stay at home. Nearly 800 schools have been closed in the northwestern part of the country. The measures are part of efforts to try and contain small outbreaks, with just 100 days to go until those games. Testing's been ramped up in at least 11 provinces. Mobile labs have been built in Beijing's neighbouring provinces for mass testing. The labs can handle up to 40,000 daily samples during the games. Yinchuan province will test around 3.5 million people for the second time, even though they were tested negative first time around. Flights and trains have come to a standstill. The Winter Olympics will be held in a closed-loop bubble, and people living in China will be only those who are allowed to buy tickets. In an arrangement brokered in part by the White House, the African Union will buy up to 110 million doses of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine. To facilitate the deal, the White House will defer delivery of some doses intended for the US. 15 million of those will be arriving before the end of 2021. The supply of doses will bring the African Union closer to its target of vaccinating 900 million people, or 70% of the continent.
The African Union will buy up to 110 million doses of the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. The arrangement, which was brokered in part by the White House, will defer delivery of some doses intended for the United States to facilitate the deal. The AU's doses will be delivered over the coming months, with 15 million arriving before the end of 2021. AU coronavirus envoy Strive Masiyiwa said in an email, "We urge other vaccine-producing countries to follow the lead of the US government and give us similar access to buy this and other vaccines." He added that the Moderna purchase represented the first time the 55-member AU had secured vaccines that were not fully produced in Africa. Still, the new shipments of vaccines are well below what Africa needs to vaccinate its 1.3 billion people. The continent has had far less access to life-saving vaccines than more prosperous parts of the world. Moderna said it was working to make it possible to fill doses of its COVID-19 vaccine in Africa by 2023 and has plans to build a manufacturing plant on the continent. Last month, the AU accused COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers of denying African countries a fair chance to buy vaccines and urged manufacturing countries, in particular India, to lift export restrictions on vaccines and their components.
It's been 3 days now since the military coup in Sudan. The latest development has seen Sudan's Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, who was arrested on Monday, along with other members of his cabinet, allowed to return to his own house, although still under tight security. Sudan's top general defended his actions, saying that the military takeover was necessary to avoid a civil war. The US State Department says the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has spoken with the deposed Prime Minister Hamdok on Tuesday. Blinken reportedly welcomed the Prime Minister's release and reiterated that all civilian leaders must be freed. The Biden administration is looking at economic tools at its disposal to respond to the situation in Sudan.
We've been in close contact with regional leaders, including in the Gulf, to make sure that we're closely coordinating and sending a clear message to the military in Sudan that they should first and foremost cease any violence against innocent civilians, that they should release those who have been detained, and they should get back on a democratic path.
Sudan's civil aviation authority suspended all flights to and from Khartoum's international airport until early Saturday, although there have since been some reports that flights may be restored before then. Sudanese airspace remains open to passing flights. Residents in Khartoum, the capital city, many of them remain defiant. Protesters have hit the streets, demonstrating against the military takeover. Protesters broke barricades and set tyres ablaze. There were also reports of Sudan's military firing at protesters. So far, 7 people have been killed and more than 140 injured while protesting. Shops have been shut in both Khartoum and its twin city Omdurman. Calls for a general strike were played over mosques' loudspeakers.
المحرك نفسه براو لأنه ما في إنترنت ما في تواصل بالهاتف فما في جهة بتقودنا لتغير لحرية وتغيير للتجمع المهنيين ما في إنترنت ما في أي جهة قايدانا حاليا الشارع قايد نفسه بنفسه براهو والمتاريس ما هيتشال لأنه بعد حوار البرهان الليلة كان النهاية ما كان مقنع فإن شاء الله يوم 30 يونيو هنطلع ونشوف
كان يمكن للخطوة الجاية دي هي مسألة العصيان المدني الشامل لأنه الآلية العسكرية اللي احنا شفناها في الشارع دي لا يمكن تقاومها إلا من خلال لحد الآن هي ناجحة بكل المقاييس دي مسألة يمكن الناس كلها مشاهدة الشوارع فاضية ما في حراك ما في دولاب العمل معطل تماما.
United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres has also urged the UN Security Council to act effectively to prevent frequent coups from occurring. The 15-member body was scheduled to discuss the military takeover in a closed-door meeting.
My appeal, obviously, is for especially the big powers to come together for the unity of the Security Council in order to make sure that there is effective deterrence in relation to this epidemic of coup d'etats. And we have seen that effective deterrence today is not in place. We have seen it in Myanmar, and we have also seen it in several African locations.
That's all we have time for on today's WION Live broadcast from London. For more global news and updates, do stay tuned to WION World is One.
There are many other...
this is right, Arab.